excited. Um, right. I'm just as excited as you are, Misha. I'm going to hand you over to Savannah now so that she can take you through.
Perfect. And hi, everybody. I see some friendly names in the chat. So excited to see you all here. We're going to talk about genre today, which I'm super excited to dive into. If you've heard my podcast, if you've heard me talk anywhere, you know that I'm a little bit of a nerd about genre. So we're going to dive into it. I'm going to share my screen here. Let me know if there's any problems with that. I'm just going to proceed as if we're all good. We're going to talk about content genres. So this is maybe a little different than what you're used to hearing when it comes to genre. We'll talk about why in a second, but in my opinion, content genres are the key to writing a story that works, no matter your experience level, no matter the genre you're writing in. So we'll dig into why in a second. But first, aside from the lovely introduction I already received, I'm Savannah. I'm a developmental editor. I host the top-ranked podcast, Fiction Writing Made Easy, and I've helped hundreds of writers write engaging stories using the step-by-step process I teach in my course and in my podcast and things like that. And like I said, I'm here to talk about how genre will help you craft a story that works and that will resonate with your target audience of readers, which is super important, right? So we're going to talk about what a story really is and how genre helps us deliver on this definition of story. And the purpose of this is just to help you focus on the key things that matter when it's time to write, because we all know what it's like to have shiny object syndrome, right? And get distracted by pretty words and editing and pulling out our thesauruses, right? It's a problem. We're going to talk about 5 things your story needs to do in order to work and to be considered a finished draft. So this is something that writers ask me all the time, like, how do I know when my draft is actually finished? How do I know if it works? We will talk about that. We're also going to talk about the difference between commercial genres and content genres. So this is what I meant earlier when I said we're going to talk about it maybe a little bit differently than you're used to talking about genre, and that'll be fun. And then we're going to go through the main content genres plus the defining characteristics of each genre. And the goal is to help you decide which ones best suit your story if you haven't made that decision already today. Okay, so put in the chat, let me know, are you guys familiar with the term content genre? I know some of you will be because I see some familiar names from my course. But if not, let me know. I see Hope and Liz saying yes. Okay, great. Tara says, I think so. Okay, great. So we're going to just take a little deep dive into it. Starting with, what does it mean to write a story that works? Because nothing that we learn about in regards to story matters if we don't know what we're trying to accomplish, right? So what does it mean to write a story that works? Do we measure working by sales numbers? Do we measure that by how reading makes us feel, the amount of fans that a book has, or something else? Maybe all of the above, maybe something else, right? I'll show you the answer to this in a second, but let me just show you also what I Googled, because I was like, what does the internet tell us about how to write a story, right? What does it mean to write a story that works? Let's ask Google. Don't write this down. Spoiler alert. I'm going to give you a better definition in a second. So Google says a story is an account of imaginary or real people and events that are told for entertainment. That's kind of true. A chain of event that begins at one place and ends at another. That's true as well. The telling of past events in someone's life or in the development of something. So all of these are true, but if we listen to Google and we write a story based on this, it's really hard to tell if this works, or it's really hard to write a story from these definitions, right? At least in my opinion. So what is a story really? Well, this is the definition I like, and it kind of merges together a lot of different methodologies and the ingredients that we need to craft a story. So I'll read this to you and then we'll go through each of the key elements. So a story is about how what happens externally affects someone who's in pursuit of a difficult goal and how that person changes internally as a result. Okay, so we're going to look at this slide multiple times. If you're writing notes, don't worry. So the first key thing here is about what happens externally. So that's a story is about what happens externally. This is the plot of your story. It's the exciting stuff that happens on the surface that makes everything else work, right? So the plot is going to affect someone who's in pursuit of a difficult goal, right? We need a specific goal. We need a goal that is difficult, because if it wasn't, what are we really reading for, right? Nothing if they can easily accomplish their goal. So it's about how what happens affects someone that's your protagonist who's in pursuit of something, and then how that person changes internally as a result. So this is key because that's that character arc. That's how the plot events have changed and shaped this person and how they've grown as a result. Okay, so this is the definition I like. And then I think it's a lot easier to write a story from this because we know if I do this, generally speaking, my story will be in good shape. So what we can take from this definition also is 5 questions that will help us write our drafts. We can kind of parse out the pieces we need and we get to these questions. Number 1, what does our protagonist want and need, right? That's part of the definition. Number 2, what's at stake? So what happens if they do or do not succeed? Number 3, what happens in the beginning, middle, and end? So what is that plot? Even if we don't have all the details, do we know enough to kind of start shaping it? What emotions are readers expecting to feel? This comes out in that internal arc of change, how we're feeling as we experience the arc, the plot arc, and the character arc. And then what point is the story making? So what is that internal change? What lesson or theme is that character learning as they navigate the external plot? Okay, so to flip this around even more, because I love looking at things from different angles, this is what a working story needs, right? So if we answer those questions, we're going to come up with a protagonist who's pursuing a singular desire or goal. That's going to establish the stakes, so what that person stands to lose or gain. And it's the pursuit of this goal that's going to cause them to face conflict, that's going to put pressure on them to grow and change, which will help you express your theme or at least hint at it in every single scene. And then all of that together evokes the emotion that you want readers to feel. So I know that we have some note takers. I will pause there. I can feel you guys rushing to jot down the notes. I am a note taker as well. Take a sip of coffee. Okay. So hopefully we're kind of getting the sense of, this is what we need to produce a story that works. And I see Christina says it's matching the skeleton blurb. That is so exciting. I love that. I love when things line up because we know in the writing world, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't, right? And it hurts our brains. All right, so now let's talk about genre, right? So how does genre help us answer those questions? How does genre help us create that definition of a story? Where doesn't matter what we're coming to this, what we're coming to the blank page with. So we might have just an idea for a character. We might have like plot events that we randomly dreamt about one night. We might have watched a movie and we're like, I want to write something like that, but I would do it different, right? So it doesn't matter what you have. You can take that definition of story or the skeleton blurb and genre will help you fill in the blanks and develop your ideas more. So we said we're going to talk about 2 different kinds of genre. The first one is commercial genres, and this is what you're used to hearing when we talk about genres. So these are the sales and marketing categories that are going to dictate where a book is placed, whether online or in a bookstore, and how it's sold and things like that. Okay, so these some examples are things like young adult fantasy. In commercial genres, we often see age ranges attached to the genre. So it could be adult, young adult fantasy, whatever, adult science fiction, paranormal romance, cozy cat mysteries, right? Like these could be little bookshelves or little sections of bookshelves. If we're a paranormal romance reader, we're going straight to that bookshelf. We know what we're in for. So most of us writers, we know the commercial genre or kind of the realm of the commercial genre we want to write in. But a lot of times with the writers I've worked with, I've seen that that's not enough to help them write their story in many cases. So, for example, if we're using the young adult fantasy example, what kind of fantasy are you writing? What is that plot about? Is it primarily a romance? Is it an action story where there's life or death stakes? Is it a mystery where they're trying to solve, I don't know, a crime in a fantasy world, right? It could be any kind of story, which is cool, but it also can be a little overwhelming if we're trying to write a story like that. So that's the thing about commercial genres. They're very important. We need to know what they are, but they don't tell you how to construct a story from the ground up necessarily. So this is where I see, like I said, some of that disconnect for new writers or writers who have struggled to maybe finish a draft before, right? So they're like, I really want to write that young adult fantasy. There's just something that's not working. In my opinion, that thing we're missing is content genres. So, like I said, I'll go through this quick. Commercial genres don't tell us the answer to those 5 questions. So they don't really give us insight into what the protagonist wants and needs, what's at stake, how to construct the general shape of a story, the emotions we're expecting to feel when reading it, or the point or theme of the story, right? So we can get some of this, but not enough to help us write stories. So content genres, this is where I think the key to success lies. I did not come up with the term content genres. This is something that Robert McKee teaches, StoryGrid teaches. Even Save the Cat has their own version of genres that, go into more detail. So content genres are essentially describing the type of content within a story. So if it's a young adult fantasy story, what type of story lives under that umbrella? Right? And each of the content genres is really a blueprint that we writers can use to inform our drafts, answer those 5 questions we talked about earlier, and write something that works. So some examples are things like action, crime, horror, love, a worldview story, so like a coming of age story, or a performance story. Any of these can take place in a fantasy world, a sci-fi world, historical world, contemporary world, right? It doesn't matter. Okay, so we're going to go through these in more detail. I'm going to keep going. Content genres are the key to answering these 5 questions because they tell you information that we need, right, to answer these questions. So these are the questions we went through earlier. We'll talk about each of the genres and how each of the genres helps you answer these in more detail. But, let's see. I have an example here. We kind of talked about this already. Young adult, this is more of our commercial genre, right? So we can walk up to a young adult section in a bookstore and we could pick up something that's like a romance, a mystery, thriller, whatever, right? We could pick up any book within the young adult section. And like I said, without knowing the content genre, we know we want to write a story for young adults, which is a great place to start, but that doesn't give us any guidance necessarily on what to include in our stories. In something like a romance, so let's say we're still writing young adult and it's going to be a young adult romance. A reader could walk into a bookstore, they could go over to the young adult romance section, browse through, or even just the romance section, right? We have an idea of what kind of book we're in for when we go to that section. Because it's a content genre, we also know what kind of scenes, character types, settings, etc. need to be present to help us deliver on all of these things that readers would be expecting coming up to our books. Okay, so we're going to go into this in a lot more detail, but hopefully these examples are kind of showing you the difference between commercial and content genres. Okay, so the key point, we have to understand both kinds of genres. So our consumer-facing commercial genre, that's really important when it comes time to pitch agents or self-publish, whatever you're going to do. But before that, we need to know what our content genre is to help us craft that story that works. Okay, how are we feeling? Let me know in the chat. I'm going to keep going because I have a lot of slides to go through. So like I said, content genres, they tell us what kind of content needs to be in a story in order for it to work and to satisfy readers. And there are really 2 types of content genres. So there are external genres. These are the ones that kind of tell you what the plot of your story is focused on. And we'll go through more detail in a second. And then there's also internal, more character-driven genres. So these tell you the recipe for success in your character's arc. So I like to think of them as external and internal, or plot and character, whatever works best for you. All right, so in the external plot-driven genres, these are stories that the main conflict is driven by an external antagonist or an antagonistic force. So these are external forces of conflict that the protagonist faces and has to overcome. So the antagonist could be something like a serial killer in a thriller. It could be like a rival basketball team in a performance story, whatever that looks like. So really this helps us figure out the plot and the antagonist and how that's going to put pressure on the protagonist. Okay, now on the flip side of this, there are character-driven genres. So these are stories where the main conflict is driven by some kind of internal force or conflict within the protagonist. So there are internal sources of conflict that the protagonist has to overcome. So this could be like self-doubt, right? A wound from the past, a debilitating fear, a feeling of unworthiness, right? Whatever that, sometimes we call it the inner obstacle or the wound, whatever that is that the protagonist needs to overcome or fail to overcome, if that's the kind of story you're writing, and has a lot of impact on their ability to succeed in the external plot. Okay, so most commercial stories have both an external content genre and an internal content genre that are woven together. There are, certain stories that have very little or no internal arc. So something like Mission Impossible, right? It's very action driven. Even something like Sherlock Holmes, it's Sherlock's not learning too many lessons in each of the books, right? Sometimes it's just about him sharpening his skills and becoming a better detective. But most stories will have both external and internal content genres, and they're woven together really seamlessly to create the experience that we as readers love. So, for example, Harry Potter, that's a mixture of the external action genre with the internal worldview arc. So, as Harry faces life and death stakes, he's undergoing a worldview shift. And we'll look at the action genre and the worldview genre in more detail in a second. Silence of the Lambs, Clarice is in a thriller plot, right? That's what's happening externally. Internally, she's undergoing a worldview shift as well. So her mind is changing about things. She's making meaning of different things, and kind of coming into her own as a detective. Pride and Prejudice, externally, we have a romance. Internally, we have a worldview arc. So Elizabeth Bennet is changing her mind about love and the people she judges in the social environment, right? The Hunger Games is an action story with a status internal arc. So, um, you know, Katniss is definitely facing some life and death stakes. And then internally, she's kind of grappling with what does that mean for her? How is she going to navigate that external plot? Okay, so when I go through these examples, we're going to start with the external genres. I want you to try to pick one external and one internal. You might have, let's say, like we're looking at the Hunger Games, right? So there's an action story, external, there's an internal status arc. Underneath that, there's a love subplot, right? Her and Peeta. So you might have three that are kind of coming to mind as things that resonate with you for your story. That's okay. Just kind of list them in a hierarchy. So what are the two up at the top? What's the main external, the main internal, and then what sits underneath that as your subplot? Okay, so we're going to go through each one by one. Hopefully we'll have enough time to go through these. If I go a little fast, it's just because I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. All right, so up first, we have the action genre. So we're going to go through kind of the key hallmarks of each of the genres and how genre helps us answer those questions, okay? So in an action story, the protagonist, their goal and their need, their want and their need is to save lives, including their own, and defeat the antagonist. So this means that what's at stake or what they stand to lose or gain is their life, the lives of others, and safety for all. Readers of action stories, we want to feel excitement. We want to feel anticipation over whether the protagonist will defeat the antagonist or not, right? And then vicariously, we want to live through the character and feel, heroic and courageous and brave, just like the protagonist does. Therefore, the theme of an action story is something like heroic action or courage or bravery, whatever we want to put in there, leads to saving lives, or villainous behavior leads to loss of life, right? So examples of action stories include things like The Hunger Games, The Dark Knight, Guardians of the Galaxy, the Wheel of Time series, Wizard's First Rule, Children of Blood and Bone, Harry Potter, Dune. So a lot of fantasy in here, but also things like Mission Impossible, right? So let me know, put a yes in the chat if you're writing an action story. We're going to keep going. Hopefully you can see how the framework helps you answer all of those questions we talked about earlier. Okay, so the crime genre, in a crime story, the protagonist wants to solve the puzzle, whether that be a murder or theft, whatever it is, right? And restore justice and order. So what's at stake in a crime story, or what that protagonist stands to lose or gain, is justice and social order. If they don't succeed, they're not going to restore justice and social order, right? So readers of crime stories, as they experience the protagonist trying to solve the puzzle and restore order, they want to feel intrigue and they want to feel concern over whether or not that mystery will be solved or that criminal will be brought to justice. So vicariously, they want to live through the protagonist and they want to feel daring and brilliant and capable of restoring order and justice, just like the protagonist. So the general theme we can kind of glean from this is that something like if it's a positive story, uncovering the truth results in justice and social order, or not pursuing the truth results in injustice and or social chaos, right? So this is just a nice little framework that helps us kind of flesh things out. So we probably know what examples of crime stories are, like Knives Out, Murder on the Orient Express, The Dresden Files, Sherlock Holmes, Ocean's 11, Breaking Bad, and the murder of Roger Ackroyd. Let me know who's writing a crime in the chat. Next up, we have the horror genre. So in this type of story, the protagonist wants to survive and they want to escape the threat of the monster. So what's at stake or what they stand to lose or gain is their life, their safety for sure, maybe even their soul, right? So this takes it a little further than the action genre, and there's a possibility of a fate worse than death. So an example of this is like, I always think about The Walking Dead, right? It's not just that you would die, it's that you would die and be forced to roam the barren earth and eat people for the rest of your life, right? There is no escape into death. So readers of horror stories, we want to feel that excitement, that tension, and that fear over whether the protagonist is going to live or die. And we want to vicariously feel brave in the face of that danger and the monster, just like the protagonist. We also want to feel quite a bit of fear while kind of doing that, right? So the general theme of a horror story is something like cleverness and bravery and determination. It could even be something like friendship, working with friends, helps us defeat the monster, or apathy and cowardice results in a loss of life. So examples of horror stories, these are things like Alien, The Shining, Coraline, Carrie, Get Out, Frankenstein, The Blair Witch Project. I mean, The Walking Dead, we know what these are, right? Let me know if you're writing a horror. I love seeing people saying, okay, maybe this is mine. I'm definitely writing this. Okay. See someone Michi writing horror. Love it. All right. So the love genre, in a love story, the protagonist, Linda says, gives me nightmares. Yeah, horror is not for everyone, right? And that's why there's so many amazing genres and so many different types of writers. In a love story, the protagonist, they want to find or be worthy of love and they want to avoid rejection. Makes sense, right? So what's at stake in a love story or what someone stands to lose or gain is that ability or that sense of intimacy, connection, and or love. When readers read these type of stories, we want to feel anticipation over whether the two people will get together or not. And in most cases, in almost all cases, we want love to prevail. So we also want to feel that romantic desire, that vulnerability. Sorry, there goes my dogs. And maybe even that sexual tension, just like the protagonist does. So we want to live vicariously through them and experience the events of the story. So the general theme of a romance story is something like desire, vulnerability, and sacrifice leads to intimacy and love. Or if you're selfish and guarded, or if you kind of let that inner obstacle or inner wound win, that results in a loss of intimacy and love. So examples of love stories include things like Outlander, Twilight, Pride and Prejudice, Bridgerton, The Notebook, things like that. Let me know if you're writing a love story, put it in the chat. Next up is the performance genre. So in these type of stories, the protagonist wants external validation, and that's usually represented by something like an award, a trophy, a title, first place in something, right? It's represented by something external. And so what's at stake in these type of stories is the protagonist stands to lose or gain that trophy or that title, but what it represents is more important, and that's that self-respect or respect from others. Readers of these type of stories, they want to feel anticipation over whether the protagonist is going to be rewarded for their efforts. So they've put in a lot of hard work and training. Are they going to be rewarded? Are they going to win or not? And they want to feel vicariously, live vicariously through the protagonist and feel what it's like to be rewarded for all that hard work and for expressing their unique gifts and talents. So the general theme of a performance story is something like Expressing those unique gifts and talents, whether we win or lose, results in that self-respect that the protagonist is seeking. Or if we hold back our gifts and talents to avoid criticism or judgment, this results in shame. So examples of these type of stories, The Mighty Ducks, Karate Kid, The Queen's Gambit, Billy Elliot, right? We kind of can get the sense these are some of the sports stories, but also performance stories where there's some kind of competition involved. Let me know who's writing this type of story. I don't see these too often, but they're pretty fun. I think the genres that we don't see too often, they're kind of fun to think about, what would a performance story look like in a fantasy world, right? Or on a spaceship, something different that we could kind of play with, which I think is fun. All right, so next up we have the society genre. So in these type of stories, the protagonist wants to gain power, whether that's personal power or worldly power. And usually they want to do this to shift the power from one person or a group to another. So what's at stake or what this person stands to lose or gain is that sense of control and or power. Readers of these type of stories, they want to feel fear and anticipation over, whether the protagonist will succeed or fail when going up against that source of power, whether it be the system or it could even be like a parent in a family unit, right? So if mom kind of rules with an iron fist and one of the kids wants to be, separate from the family, we want to feel that fear and anticipation over whether it's going to work. And vicariously, we want to live through them and feel that sense of courage and bravery that they have to succeed in the plot. So the general theme of a story like this is something like power is gained by standing up to and exposing tyrants. And then power is lost when we don't stand up to and expose tyrants, which means we allow them to squash those revolutions that we might incite. And eventually they will just remain in power, right? Which is not ideal. So examples of society stories, these are things like Thelma and Louise, Anna Karenina, even The Godfather would count here, Animal Farm, Dead Poet Society, and even Lessons in Chemistry. So Lessons in Chemistry is kind of a good, I don't want to say softer example of this, but we might not, we're talking about power, right? We might not think of, a woman at work trying to gain power, but that's very much a society story. She's a woman in the, I think it's 50s or 60s, right? And she's unable to get ahead in life and in work because of her gender. So she wants to shift that power, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. It's a great example of a society story. Let me know if anybody's writing this type of story, put a yes in the chat. And then I think we're on our last one of the external. So remember, we want to pick one external and then one internal, okay? So the last one in external is thriller. In this type of story, the protagonist wants to stay alive and they want to stop the antagonist from causing further harm or future harm. Okay, so a crime story, there's a difference. Crime stories are usually about what happened in the past. So solving a murder or figuring out who done it, who stole the necklace, whatever that looks like. Thrillers are usually about, something happened, I'm going to prevent something else from happening, or I know something's happening and I want to prevent it from happening. Plus, there's usually more life and death stakes in a thriller than in a crime. So that's a question I get asked all the time. All right, so what's at stake in a thriller, what the protagonist stands to lose or gain is their life, their safety, and maybe even their soul here as well. So kind of like the horror genre, there is a possibility of a fate worse than death. So, imagine at the last minute, the protagonist, chooses, I don't know, not to stop the antagonist, or they do stop the antagonist, whatever, but a victim gets lost in the process. And so they kind of live with this soul scar, right? Which to some could be a fate worse than death. Readers of thrillers, we want to feel excitement and anticipation over whether that protagonist is going to succeed or fail in stopping the antagonist. And we want to feel daring and brave and courageous, just like the protagonist does. Because, sometimes, a lot of times thrillers are about that kind of average person that, steps in and stops the bad guy. We want to be that average person that stops the bad guy. At least I do. All right, so the general theme of a thriller story is something like bravery in the pursuit of justice, is going to save lives, where tyranny and letting injustice go unpunished can destroy lives. And examples of these type of stories include things like The Silence of the Lambs, Gone Girl, Misery, The Girl on the Train, a lot of girl stories in this genre, Sharp Objects, when one of us is lying, you can see the examples on screen. Okay, so let me know if you're writing this type of story. Remember I said earlier, the external genres, these are going to really help you flesh out and, represent your plot events and what your character is going to be pursuing. So it helps us answer a majority of those questions we went over earlier, but there's another layer to it, and that's your internal genre. So the external genre is representing the plot and what your character wants. The internal genre represents your character's arc, or how they're going to grow and change throughout the story. So this is going to be what your character needs in order to get what they want or to succeed in that external plot. Okay. So I see Mary says, where does status story fall? We're getting to that one in a second. So the first internal genre that we have here is morality. So in these type of stories, remember, we're focused on what the protagonist needs and how that character arc unfolds. So in these type of stories, the protagonist needs to overcome their selfishness or that me-centric behavior and learn to willingly sacrifice for others. So what's at stake, or what they stand to lose or gain, is that freedom from like shame or guilt that they're usually carrying about past actions or whatever is making them selfish. Or they can gain that transcendence or that forgiveness or that comfort that comes from acting a little more altruistically. So as readers of these type of stories, we want to feel inspired by that protagonist growth and that selflessness that they learn how to have, or we're going to feel pity if they fail to grow. So a lot of readers of these stories, we want to feel like if we were in their shoes, we're capable of doing the right thing. We're capable of redemption, things like that. So the theme in a morality story is something like selfless action leads to redemption, or selfishness leads to moral failure and shame, right? So we can kind of see how that would work out. Examples of stories that have arcs like this would be things like Manchester by the Sea, Wall Street, The Scarlet Letter, Old Man in the Sea, Flight, A Christmas Carol, Atonement, Groundhog Day, and even Better Call Saul. Okay, so remember, these are paired with an external genre to help the plot and the character arc work together. All right, so here we go with status. In the status story, what the protagonist needs is to redefine success and grow in self-esteem, regardless of what their external success looks like. So what's at stake, or what this person stands to lose or gain, is that self-esteem, maybe their place in the social order. So it could be like their place at work, their place in the ballet company, whatever that is. And then, of course, they stand to lose or gain success and honor as well. Readers of these type of stories, we want to feel hopeful that that protagonist will succeed. We will feel pity if they fail, right? We're going to feel sorry for them. And vicariously, we want to live through their journey and feel like we're capable of coming out the other side with a raised self-esteem, and redefining success, just like the protagonist. So the general theme of a story like this is something like, if you stay true to your values and make choices aligned with those values, this is what creates true success, whether it leads to social betterment or not. So, stay true to your values. This is what's going to create that true alignment and that feeling of success in you, instead of rising the ranks in your ballet company and doing something that does not align with who you are, right? The negative side of this is achieving superficial goals that lead to selling out your personal values is not always ideal, right? So you're going to basically end with, you might get the thing you want, but you're going to feel pretty nasty inside, most likely. So examples of stories like this include things like Milk, Little Miss Sunshine, A Little Princess, The Hate You Give, Rudy, Great Expectations, and even Sense and Sensibility. Okay, so last up, we have the worldview genre, and I would say this is, most stories can fall in this category. So if you're not sure, you're probably writing a worldview story. This encompasses pretty much everything. Okay, so in a worldview story, the protagonist needs to really let go of whatever old beliefs or outdated worldviews are holding them back from success or happiness or love, whatever it is, and adopt new beliefs or new worldviews or new values in place of those old ones. So, what's at stake or what this person stands to lose or gain is the knowledge, wisdom, meaning, or maturity that comes with, kind of growing up or getting um, a new like a new worldview to live life through, right? If we don't do that, we're not going to gain the wisdom, we're not going to gain the knowledge or the meaning or the maturity that comes with a lot of life experiences. So readers of these type of stories, we want to feel anticipation over whether that protagonist is going to face the truth and grow and change or not. And as readers, we want to feel like we have that opportunity to grow and change and mature, and that, we'll be okay in the face of life's challenges and changes, because those can be scary, right? So, the general theme of a worldview story is something like facing the truth and letting go of outdated beliefs or values that allows for growth. Avoiding the truth and clinging to those outdated beliefs results in comfortable ignorance and or stagnation. Okay, so examples of stories that have a worldview arc are things like The Perks of Being a Wallflower, The Great Gatsby, Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, Looking for Alaska, Stand By Me, The Catcher in the Rye, and even The Magicians. So I'm curious, who has identified their internal genre or their pairing of external and internal genres? Let me know. Hopefully you can see how when we went through those, it really helps us, each of the genre frameworks helps us answer these 5 questions. So again, with their what does your protagonist want and need, the framework gives you that generic information. You can tailor it and make it more specific to your idea, which is really cool. It tells us what's at stake. So what does a protagonist stand to lose or gain? It gives us a sense of what's going to happen in the beginning, middle, and end. There's more to this framework, which I'll talk to you about in a second, that really answers this question. We know what emotions readers are expecting to feel, and we kind of know the point of the story or the theme that we're exploring if we write that type of story. So really cool. We get a lot of information from just deciding on our genres, right? Now, you might be wondering, well, what about science fiction and fantasy? I kind of talked about this earlier. Remember, these are commercial genres or consumer-facing labels, right? So these tell the reader and the writer that there's going to be fantastic, magical, scientific, or futuristic elements in a story, but they don't tell us what the story is actually going to be about or the emotional experience they're going to get as they read the story, right? And like I said earlier, this is what makes it really hard for writers to write science fiction or fantasy, even historical fiction, right? We need to identify what type of story we're writing, and then we'll have a much easier time. So what this means, if you're writing fantasy, science fiction, or even historical fiction, we need to decide on at least one of those content genres in order to craft something that works. So you could write an action story that takes place in a futuristic setting, a romance that takes place in a fantasy world, or whatever combination you want. So again, if we were to kind of boil down these stories to what's their primary genre, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, it's an action story. There are life and death stakes. But like we said earlier, Harry has a very strong worldview arc. He's maturing and growing and changing and, learning that he can be the boy who lived that everybody thinks he is, right? In Outlander, that's primarily a romance, but there's an internal arc there as well. The protagonist is, without spoilers, deciding, is she going to stay in the past with one man or go back to the present and be with another man? The Dresden Files, those are crime stories. And then Pet Sematary, of course, is horror. Okay, so again, if we're writing fantasy, sci-fi, historical fiction, we just want to start choosing content genres to make our lives a whole lot easier. Now, I said earlier that we kind of have another piece to this puzzle, and it really is going to speak to what happens in the beginning, middle, and end of each story, right? So once you've identified your genre, there's a handful of key scenes and conventions that are, readers expect these things to be present in a story in order for them to work. So these key scenes or these obligatory scenes, these are the key plot points that take your character on a journey from A to Z. So a love story is a very easy example of this. We expect the characters to meet. We expect them to fall in love. We expect their intimacy to develop, whether that looks like, holding hands or a first kiss, or maybe they sleep together, depending on the heat level of your story. In most cases, there's some kind of breakup, and then by the end, they're getting that happily ever after, right? So the obligatory scenes or those key scenes just help you frame your ideas into something that takes your character and reader on a journey. Conventions are the character roles, settings, and micro events or circumstances that readers expect to be present in a particular genre. So when you combine these two things, they help you write a story that works, and they help you flesh out your idea and start to craft the beginning, middle, and end of whatever story you're working on. So as a very quick example, this is just the action story key scenes. So just like we talked about in the romance arc, it's how the romance develops over time, right? In an action story, it's kind of how the protagonist's life is threatened and how they grow and change and eventually defeat the antagonist or not. So we have to start it off with something that threatens their life, right? Whether they consciously know it or not. Somewhere in the middle, they understand the true nature of kind of what's happening around them, what that antagonist wants, and the clock starts ticking. So do something about it or you're not going to survive. And then in the climax, we see them kind of use their whatever makes them unique or their special gift, whatever. They're going to face the antagonist and either come out alive or not. And then, we see what happens at the end. So each genre has a framework like this that just shows you if you, put your ideas into this generic framework, you're going to craft something that matches kind of what readers expect to see, but you can, of course, totally make it your own. Okay, and then in terms of conventions, I saw that Christina said we'll share the replay later. So I'll just pick a few of these, but in an action story, right? A convention is that their goal is to stop the antagonist and save victims, right? That's what we expect when we come to an action story. The antagonist is stronger and or more powerful than the protagonist. It's a convention and we expect to see it because if this wasn't the case, then what would the story really be about, right? There are sidekicks who help the protagonist along their journey and eventually to save victims. And there's a ticking clock that puts pressure on the protagonist because if not, sometimes we wouldn't act, right? So there's just a lot of information you can glean from your key scenes and conventions in your genre. And yeah, you can go through this later on the replay and look at that in more detail. Now, a question I get asked all the time when I talk about key scenes and conventions is like, are these tropes? Are these bad? Are they cliche, right? And I like to think about the key scenes and conventions like blank coloring book pages. So they're there to help you craft that framework. And then the way that you color them in can include tropes or not that are cliche or not, right? So some examples, the convention of the mentor in an action story. This isn't telling you like who your mentor needs to be. It's not saying he needs to be an old man with a beard who's a wizard, right? A mentor could be a pig. It could be a child. It could be a diary. It could be anything, right? It's what is the purpose of the mentor? It's to help your character grow and learn and be prepared for the end. So it's more about asking why it matters and then making it unique to you and your story. The second one I like to talk about is the chosen one. So that's just a way of delivering your protagonist, right? You need a protagonist. They don't have to be the chosen one. They can be the anti-chosen one. They can just be a regular person. They can be whatever you want. So like I said, genre conventions, they usually have more of an objective reason why they exist, while tropes do not. So another one that's coming to mind is a love triangle in a romance, right? So that's a convention for a reason, but no one's saying it has to be rich suitor versus poor suitor, right? That's a trope. It doesn't have to be like old boyfriend versus, or like childhood boyfriend versus current guy. It doesn't have to be like a bad guy versus a good guy, right? It doesn't have to be any of these things. You can make it whatever you want. Okay, so I'm going to recap the key points that we talked about. Hopefully you guys are feeling good. Then we will open it up for questions. But key points. So a story, this is the definition I like. Feel free to take it and run with it. A story is about how what happens externally affects someone who's in pursuit of a difficult goal and how that person changes as a result. When writing our own stories, we can't just think about the external plot events. We also need to consider how those events affect your character and force them to make a long needed change in order to be successful or to get what they want. So this is what this definition really helps us do, helps us marry the external and the internal, and same with the genres. If we pick those two, it's going to help us marry those together. So if we I didn't include this slide, but I like this point. So if we kind of flip around those 5 questions or what we're trying to do, we're trying to create a story that works, right? So it's going to work when it evokes empathy for the characters. The setup of that is in our genre framework. We want to create tension and excitement. We want to communicate a thoughtful takeaway, provide a satisfying emotional experience, no matter what that is that we want. And meet the reader's expectations. So this is, how as a coach and an editor, when I tell an author, okay, I think your story works, it's ready to go to publishing, whatever that next step is, this is usually kind of what I'm looking for. And really does it meet the expectations of readers of that genre, and does it surprise and delight them in, new and fun and different ways? Okay, so as writers, we need to be both aware of the commercial and the content genres for our books. And remember that the content genre tells us how to craft that compelling story, and the commercial genre tells us how to market it once we're done. Most stories are going to have both an internal and an external genre. So the conflict in that external genre, that's driven by that external antagonist or antagonistic force. And then the conflict in the internal genre comes from inside the protagonist. And the conflict works together, right? So in a love story, the antagonist is typically the love interest. They put pressure on the protagonist's internal wound, and that's what helps create that internal conflict. Okay. And then again, if you're writing science fiction or fantasy, even historical fiction, you will want to choose your main content genres to craft a story that works and something that will satisfy readers and create that emotional experience that they are hoping for. Okay, so that's kind of key point wrap up. Hopefully you now know how your story's genre can help you craft a story that works and that resonates with your target audience of readers. And I am very happy to answer some questions.
That's absolutely fabulous. Thank you, Savannah. That was amazing. I've been taking notes. It's just like wowzers. Brilliant. So any questions that are in here, you were answering just about all of them that I saw when they came up, which is amazing. Getting lots of thank yous from everything. I'm sure there's lots of light bulb moments that are happening for everyone. Christina's got a great question here. What is the most common question you get about a genre?
Yeah, that is a great question. And there are a few that I can talk through as we wait for other questions to come through. So one of them is like, well, my story has flavors of everything. Does that mean I have every genre? In truth, most stories include little flavors of everything. So what we want is for you to focus on kind of creating a hierarchy. And I always say stick to 3 genres in your hierarchy. So what are the 2 up top, the main external and the main internal? And then kind of what's the main subplot underneath that? So if you're writing an action story with a worldview internal arc, maybe you have a romance subplot, or maybe you have a mystery subplot, right? And the reason we want to create that hierarchy is to avoid something I see a lot in the drafts I edit, which is, let's say we're writing that same makeup of stories. So an action worldview with a romance subplot. Sometimes what happens is it starts out reading like a romance, and then in the end, it's like you're facing off with the villain. So you don't have the setup of the action story in the beginning, and then in the end, you don't get that payoff that readers are expecting from the love story beginning that you set up, right? So we create this mismatch, and that's why a hierarchy is so important. The other question I get a lot is, what happens if my story doesn't fit into any of these, right? And I think anyone can choose their own adventure and do whatever they want. But I think if we were to kind of pick and just say what one sounds like the most the most like my story, even if it doesn't fit exactly, all the different pieces, it's still better to use some kind of framework and just say like, if I'm trying to write a story that kind of feels like a thriller, right? Maybe I don't like this convention or whatever the pieces that we don't agree with. That's okay as long as we have an informed reason why we don't want it or what we're going to do to make up for that experience in the story. So let's see. I do see some questions coming
Yes.
through.
So you've got one from Ash Hannelaw. I'm going to have to ask two more questions, and then
Okay.
I'm going to leave it for you to get because I've got another call to go
Okay.
and cover. Right. So Ash is. I must say the amount of thank yous I'm getting, Savannah, is huge. Okay. So thank you so much. I'm interested in whatever advice you have when writing a series to apply content genre.
Okay. This is a fun question, and it's kind of a can of worms question, which I like. Um, I'll start with the mistake I see writers make when it comes to writing a series. The mistake is changing up the genres versus because writers think if I change the genres, that's going to create excitement and it's going to make things different. But really, what that does is it delivers a mixed experience for the reader. So recently, I was reading, and you guys let me know in the chat if you've read the A Discovery of Witches series. I don't know what the series is called, but it's by Deborah Harkness. So I read the first book. I loved it. It was very action, fantasy. She had a nice internal arc. There was romance. Then we got to the second book and it felt like a totally different story. And it was something that as a reader, I was kind of like, well, I'm not interested. It read more like historical fiction. And as a reader, I'm not quite interested in historical fiction. So for me, going from book one to book two, it was a very jarring, different and kind of disappointing experience, not because the book was bad necessarily. I don't know if it was good or bad because I didn't finish it. That's how jarring it was for me. But the key point is she mixed up the types of stories, and as a reader, it created a weird experience. So what I say is in the series genre, you're probably writing the same type of story across your series. And the key is to think about how to escalate and grow and complicate the stakes from book to book and the problems instead of changing up the genre. And I have an episode on my podcast about how to start writing a series. If you haven't heard that, it's I would say one of the last 5 episodes if you want to check it out.
Absolutely fabulous. So we've got Mary Noakes here. Is it fair to say that convention are expected character-driven actions where key scenes are what should happen to provide conflict and move story forward? Also, aren't some stories a little bit of overlap as several internal genres sometimes, which you've already answered? Many of them seem that they could be worldview to some degree, morality to some degree, and or status to some degree.
Yeah, and so in my perspective, if you're having trouble with the internal genres, I'm always going to advise you to default to worldview because you can fit anything in a worldview genre. For example, in morality, we talk about being selfish or altruistic, right? And the character's learning to be either, I guess, more selfish or more altruistic. So think about that in a worldview frame, right? It's like maybe I'm selfish in the beginning because I never got what I needed as a child. So we carry this grudge and, we just want to make sure we look out for number one. And then let's say we're in a romance arc. So we meet a person and they show us what it means to be altruistic, and our meaning or the way that we relate to life changes, right? So we have a worldview change that affects how selfish or altruistic we are in the world. So, I think if it were me, when in doubt, go worldview because you can make anything fit in worldview. And you know, people identify with different genres. So if it makes more sense to you to write a story like that in the morality genre, go for it. If it makes sense to frame it as worldview, go for it. It's not going to be wrong.
Brilliant. Okay, so there's two more questions, but I do have to leave after this one. So I'm on Corinne's. What if you're writing a dual genre, i.e., romantic suspense? Savannah, you're amazing. Speak to you soon, and I'm going to watch the recording to find your answer.
Okay, thank you. All right, so if you're writing romantic suspense, you will want to still choose your hierarchy, right? So in most cases in romantic suspense, it's going to follow the thriller framework because the romance is a part of what we need to the protagonist needs to experience to be successful in the thriller plot, right? So I like to think about it as you have multiple dials, like volume dials, right? So in a thriller with, let's say, a very small romance subplot, your romance dial is going to be turned down to like, let's say 15. I'm just making this up. And the thriller volume will be turned up to like 80, 85%, right? It's going to be very loud. In a romantic suspense, you might have both dials turned a little more equally. So the romance becomes a bigger part of the thriller plot than if it was just like a suspense story with a flavor of love, if that makes sense. So you have dials that you can work with. Same with something like romantasy, right? You could write a fantasy story with a love subplot, and the love subplot could be turned way down in volume, or it could be turned all the way up in volume, right? But at the end of the day, what are the external stakes? Are we reading to find out if the characters get together, and that's like we want that happily ever after, and that's a convention of the romance genre? Or are we reading for that suspense and to find out if we stop the bad guy and if they get together along the way? So hopefully that makes sense. Let's see. Tara says, so the hierarchy is number 1 external, number 2 internal, and number 3 subplot. In general, yes. Sometimes it's flipped. So thinking about something like Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine. I would say that story is more like the number 1 spot is internal. So again, it just comes down to dials. But like a different example is something like Harry Potter's very easy example. So there are life and death stakes in that story, right? So his story can't be purely worldview because he's not sitting around thinking, gosh, I'm unhappy and I wish I knew how to change my circumstances. He's more like, what the heck is that package? And now I'm involved with Lord Voldemort. And as a result of the plot, I'm having this worldview change, right? So it's like a subtle difference. And if it helps, if you're like, I don't like the 1, 2, and 3, put the 2, 1 external and 1 internal at the top, and then your subplot underneath. That's what I do personally. Let's see. Eve says, in a morality arc, could the protagonist go from being unaccountable to accountable? Possibly, especially if it's like mixed with a crime story or something like that. The movie Flight comes to mind because that's kind of how that character is. Like he does something bad because he's selfish, and then by the end he's held accountable, but also he takes accountability. So. I think what you're describing works. Let's see. I think I got all the questions. I know, Christina, your voice is not working, but should I sign off? Give me a thumbs up if I should sign off. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna let you guys go. Thank you so much for having me, Christina and everybody. And if you want more information on the genres, I have breakdowns of each of the genres on my website as well as my podcast. So feel free to go check those out and have a good rest of your day and a good rest of your week. All right, bye everybody.